Hello, welcome to Revenant Reads. I'm Vin, and this is another edition of Fresh Red Kills. So, Fresh Red Kills are the videos where I talk about the books I have recently finished reading. I'm going to be talking about two books that I read for Q2 of Historathon 2025. That is a year-long event where we read, discuss, and celebrate nonfiction history. And Q2, which runs April, May, and June, looks at the years 500 to 1500. So in the Western world, that would mostly be the Middle Ages. And I made sure to begin that with my favorite topic, and that would be the Norse, basically Viking history. And I have some interesting titles here, so I'm going to talk about two of them, The Return of the Dead and The Real Valkyrie. So first, let's talk about The Return of the Dead. One of my major interests is in the sort of pre-Christian religion, pre-Christian mindset, especially as it relates to things like the Norse, Germanic, Anglo-Saxons, that whole realm. That's definitely a major a topic of extreme interest for me. And this was a marriage also with another major topic of interest that I have, and that would be something my channel is named after, revenants and ghosts and things like that. So here we have The Return of the Dead, Ghosts, Ancestors, and the Transparent Veil of the Pagan Mind. And this is by Claude Lecouteux. I don't know if I'm saying that right, but he's French. This was originally published in French, I think in 1996, and the English translation here was published in 2009. And he is looking at the concept of the dead, and especially the undead, right, of ghosts and revenants, as the pre-Christian Norse and Germans, as they would have actually understood it. Okay, so what can we figure out before Christianity's arrival, before Christianity affected things? What can we know about how they thought? And I thought he did a really good job with this. Of course, he has to rely heavily on things like sagas, to try and glean certain evidence. And he really does. He describes a world in which the dead are not gone. Okay, so for the pagans, the world of the living, the world of the dead, they overlapped. Okay, so the dead are probably mostly invisible. But they are around. Even like if you're going to pray to or give offerings to the Alfar, the elves, those elves might actually be like ancestral spirits. They might be the dead. Sometimes the dead come back physically as revenants. Sometimes those revenants are fairly benign. Sometimes they are hostile, but often they have sort of supernatural abilities. But you have this whole sense that the dead were thought to always be around. In one way or another, that they were a presence, that just because somebody died didn't mean that they were gone. There's a really great description. I don't know if it comes from one of the sagas, but basically people lay out a feast for the dead, and then the dead arrive. The saga or the story talks about how, the men who were buried in dirt come in covered in dirt, the men who drowned were come in dripping wet, and they don't say anything. They just come down, they sit, and they eat with everybody, and they leave. But I think it's a good representation of sort of how they thought about things. The world between the living and the dead, it was malleable, it was permeable. The dead could come back, and sometimes they would give counsel. They were asked to give counsel. They were still a part of the process. They were still a part of the community. I think that's maybe an important part of this whole thing, is that the dead were seen as still part of the community. They weren't banished from it. They weren't ostracized from it. Just because you were dead didn't mean that you were forgotten. And he goes into various, he has like false revenants, like things that, let me see, maybe are not quite revenants. He got true revenants, discussions of the soul. He kind of reevaluates Beowulf and kind of views, I think, Grendel's mother, in terms of maybe being like more like revenants. We got some interesting illustrations in there as well. But I just thought this whole thing was fascinating. And he really does sort of present things in a way that makes you feel like we've maybe really forgotten something. Or lost something along the way in the Christianization. He talks about, how we don't view revenants in the dead in the same way. And then he kind of ends with this, which I thought was poignant. He says, currently, revenants are in the final stages of dying, slowly fading away as the family unit dissolves, ancestral traditions vanish, and death becomes the business of specialists. Death has become anonymous, as feared by the poet Rainer Maria Rilke. People no longer die at home, surrounded by family, but in hospitals or hospices, from where they are taken to stone gardens on the periphery of the community of the living, and are no longer huddled around the church in the very center of town. How are they to return? And more important, why should they come back if the living let the dead know in this way that their disappearance is a definitive one? The treatment the dead receive is related to the reduction in hauntings, except in places like Sicily, Romania, Hungary, etc., where lanterns are left on graves. Moving on, they're no longer cherished as before. Cemeteries are no longer meeting places where people go to share the latest news with the dead. Once upon a time, people would sit upon the cairn of the dead at times when important decisions were made. The memory of the dead was passed down from one generation to the next, and their names were borne by their descendants. Today, there are no longer any feasts or toasts in their honor. No more obligations, no more requests for help, no more confidences, no more visits, no more community. The attitude of men is responsible for the extinction of reverence. Because it is no longer reality, the figure of the dead person no longer obsesses anyone to the point that it takes on material shape. This figure is no longer a guarantor of the social order, where it once compelled the living to respect laws and commandments, religion, and tradition. By losing this role, ghosts and revenants have now lost their place in society. The door to the other world is closed, and beyond keeps our elders for eternity. And you kind of, I think you can hear his little bit of regret in there, that, we seem to have lost something, and maybe at the cost of respecting and remembering those that died. So anyhow, I thought this was a really fascinating study. I'm glad that I read this before I read the Vinland sagas for Saga Long 2025, because I think it gave me a lot of insight into some of the weird supernatural things that I was reading in that. And then I followed it up with this one, The Real Valkyrie, The Hidden History of Viking Warrior Women by Nancy Marie Brown. And this is all based on, see if they have a number in here. Well, there's a grave in Birka that people had assumed was a male warrior for many, many years. And then through DNA testing and, various scientific testing, they realized this was a woman's grave. So she is focusing on that grave and what it means to be a possible, to have female warriors inside the Viking world. And she does it in an interesting way that I did kind of struggle with for a while. But otherwise, I think that it mostly works. So she basically takes an archaeological view here, and I'm really happy about that. I think it was last year, the year before, I read a book that was also called Valkyrie, about women in the Viking Age, but it was really heavily based on sagas, and there wasn't as much archaeological work. Here we have much more of an archaeological focus, and not nearly as much with the sagas. And I've come to find that when it comes to scholarship of the Norse and of the Vikings, you have especially your linguist specialists who focus on sagas, and you have your archaeologists. And they can often come to different conclusions, and they don't always communicate very well with each other. So it's really important to kind of get different perspectives if you want to know about this area of history. So she does an interesting thing here. She essentially looks at the items that are inside the grave, and then she almost creates like a fan fiction around it. She imagines maybe what this woman's life would have been like. So each chapter, it's almost like a fan fiction of this character that she's created, and what her life might have been like. And then she follows that up. That only takes up a small part of the chapter. The rest of the chapter is her giving us the background on all the archaeological stuff that she is basing this on. So along the way, you have to keep reminding yourself that she is referring to a fictional person. Yes, the archaeological evidence is real, and the history that she ultimately ends up telling us is real. But when she's referring to this person in the grave, it is a fictional person. So there's a certain amount of, I don't know, I don't want to say mental acrobatics that you have to do, but it took me a while to adjust that sort of thing. That being said, she does a really good job presenting the archaeological evidence, and this is a really good look into cultural and material history in the Viking Age. She goes into long passages about things like board games in the Viking world, or, you know, how they would have gone about spinning thread. The sorts of things that you don't often get in history, but I love cultural history, and I think the material history is also really, really interesting. You know, everything from, you know, the weapons to entertainment to some of the clothing that was found inside there. So again, it's a weird, it comes off a little bit awkward at times. And yet, in the end, I think it overall worked. And one of the things that she's trying to stress here is that a lot of our interpretation of the archaeological finds is based on when they were first being found in the Victorian era. And those archaeologists basically interpreted them with their own gender biases, their own concept of what men and women were. And she is trying to break down that and say we need to reevaluate these items, not with these sort of Victorian mentalities of what a woman does and what a man does. She brings up the whole fact that we often associate Viking women or Norse women with having keys like hanging from their belt as like, you know, maybe symbols of their, you know, domestic power or something. But she says that's only mentioned like twice in all these sagas. And we don't know if that's reflective of the Viking age or of the later age in which those things were written down. But we have countless examples of women taking up swords and arms and fighting, and yet we dismiss those things as like fantasy, and we focus on keys. So I think she has maybe a valid argument there. So it's interesting. Like I said, there's the whole fan fiction part I had a hard time adjusting to, but when you get to a lot of the arguments and the deep dive into the archaeological pieces, I think that there's some really good stuff in here. So yeah, I thought that I had quarter two off to a pretty good start for Historathon. So once again, I read The Return of the Dead, Ghosts, Ancestors, and the Transparent Veil of the Pagan Mind, and The Real Valkyrie, The Hidden History of Viking Warrior Women by Nancy Marie Brown. Yes, there's a lot of conjecture in here, but I think there's also a lot of good information as well. If you've read either of these, I'd love to hear your thoughts. And as always, thank you, BookTube.